Note: the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of Three Gimbals. Hey everyone, welcome back to Navigating in Balance, a podcast by Three Gimbals. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome back Martin Brown, student researcher at FIU's Security Research Hub and student expert also on China-Latin America relations. Today, we are going to be diving into a really cool episode that I'm really excited about. Today, we're talking about ports and profits, China's Peruvian power play, and the way that China is exercising influence in the country of Peru. So, gonna hit a couple different things. One, how does strategic infrastructure and resource extraction extend to Chinese geopolitical and economic leverage across the Pacific? We're going to be talking a little bit about foreign direct investment, issues of sovereignty, supply chain control, and also things like strategic vulnerability and what that means. So without further ado, I want to lead off with this thought. So when does a port or a piece of infrastructure like a port become a platform for power projection, right? When does mining become a matter of national security? So today, we're going to really dive into those questions and explore how China's growing its footprint in Peru through two of its most consequential projects. Those two projects being, first of all, the Port of Chancay, and second, the Las Bambas copper mine. And Martin Brown is here to help us break it all down. So, Martin, if you could give yourself a little bit of an introduction for those in the audience who may not know who you are, and then we can dive right into it.
All right. Well, thank you, Ben. I'm Martin Brown. As Ben said, I am a student researcher here at Florida International University's Jack D. Orr Institute's Security Research Hub, where my work mainly deals in looking and understanding Chinese investments and engagements in Latin America and the Caribbean, using the Diamphil framework from the DoD to really hone in and understand the region itself.
There you go. No, thank you, Martin, for being here. Appreciate it. So when we're kind of thinking about Chinese influence in Peru specifically, you know, we know that China has a foothold in a lot of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. Through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which we've talked about on this show. Also a lot of great resources out there to learn about that. But Peru is a little bit different in that some of the historical ties that it has with China are notably different than some of the countries that border it. For example, the native Tusan population, ethnic Chinese people who emigrated to Peru, many of them coming over in the mid to late 1800s working on infrastructure projects, and they stayed, and it spawned an entire path of cultural fusion, everything from food to language and beyond. So this is a country with stronger ties to China than some might be led to believe. And, you know, we another hot topic, I just came across this and I thought that it might be relevant to share. You know, you hear in the news a lot now, or you read about things of countries that are not recognizing Taiwan, or maybe they are, and, you know, which countries recognize Taiwan's sovereignty and which countries recognize Taiwan as being Chinese. And for Peru, I mean, this was all said and done back in 1971. So They were already very much in the PRC party line stance all the way back then. So this is nothing new for China. But let's kind of, I guess, proceed with the conversation with those assumptions in mind, which I think are a little different.
Yeah, for sure. No, can't wait. China's immigration to Peru has been long, and it has been a very deep-seating soft power play in Peru, not because, China sent them purposely, but because they were fleeing to China for work in Latin America, the Caribbean. And, Now you see barrios chinos all over Latin America. You see them in Argentina. The oldest one being, of course, in Panama, really because of the Panama Canal construction caused for many migrant workers to go there naturally. But of course, Peru, Chile have large populations of Chinese or Asian descendants because of the immigration that occurred in the late 18th century, 19th century.
No, absolutely. And I think that's valuable context because, I know to me, being based in the U.S., I don't often, like, I'm not as familiar with immigration patterns and cultural dynamics in other places, obviously speaking about it within our own country. But, so I think that's helpful context for kind of where we're proceeding from here. That being said, we're here to talk about some of China's major projects and undertakings in Peru. I wanted to start off by introducing the topic of the Port of Chancay. So, when we talk about the Port of Chancay, first off, could you introduce what is it, who are its backers?
Well, the Port of Chancay is a multi-purpose deep water megaport, located in Chancay, Peru. It officially opened and started operating at full capacity November 2024, costing from the range of $3 to $3.6 billion. The port is expected to be a major maritime expressway linking South America and Asia. We'll get into that later. But it was developed through a partnership between COSCO Shipping Ports, a Chinese company, and China's largest state-owned shipping company, and Vulcan Compañía Minera, which is a major Peruvian mining firm. But COSCO holds a 60% stake in Chancay, while Vulcan only holds 40%. This is one of China's largest logistical hubs in the Pacific coast, and it was developed in two stages. The first stage was estimated to cost around $1.3 billion to complete an operating zone with 4 berths, 2 being for containers and 2 for multi-purpose, also including an administrative and logistical complex, and also a 1.8 kilometer tunnel that can connect the operating zone with the logistical complex. And the second stage was really focusing on the port itself, that once the operating zone was complete, it would have 11 more docks and 15 more berths. But the Port of Chancay itself has had a lot of environmental and social concerns behind it. There's been significant concerns regarding the impact on the local community and environment. Some fear that the construction could crack older, more brittle homes in nearby communities, as cracks have already occurred in homes due to explosions to flatten terrain to build both the tunnel and port. And there has been job loss concerns as this port has greatly affected local fisheries. And the estimated suggests 3,000 fishermen may be displaced due to the port's expansion.
Wow. So, okay, there's it's a giant infrastructure investment.
Yeah.
We're talking in the billions of dollars. So only a handful of projects in the country are approaching that amount. Massive project
In the region.
Massive implications for the local community. What about this project is so strategically significant to China? Like, obviously, it's a deep water port.
Yeah.
But why Peru and why Chancay?
Well, first, there's a geographical importance, right? The Chancay port is 78 kilometers north of Lima, positioned to serve critical hub between Asia and South America to make it faster, more effective maritime route. Usually from China to Peru, it's 35 to 40 days travel. Now with this port, it'll just be 23, enabling reduced fuel consumption and lower operating costs, right? This also enables for economic integration to occur within the country at a more efficient rate. A tunnel connecting the port to the central Peruvian mining region will streamline access to rich minerals of Peru, particularly copper, a major export for Peru, especially to China, allowing easier extraction and transport of vital raw materials. But also BRI plays a role into this, right? As this port plays a key role into the BRI ambitions, enhancing trade between Asia and South America. China's broader strategy is, of course, to build the global network of maritime trade routes to strengthen influence in both trade and logistics. But finally, this has a strategic military perspective from this. And from a military standpoint, right, the port being deep water could become a strategic asset for China, as it can accommodate large PLA Navy ships and submarines. And the distance from the U.S. can provide a shield from direct military threats, enabling China to still have naval power and projection within the West Coast. And of course, the Carnegie Endowment highlights that such port networks can also be used for intelligence gathering, allowing operators to track military cargo, routes, and other data valuable to China's military intelligence operations. Because Chinese law dictates that these companies need to abide by the Chinese government. So with any surveillance or intelligence gathering, the Chinese government can just ask for the information.
Wow. That was actually going to be my next question, and I'm really glad you hit that answer, because thinking ahead, great minds think alike. But no, I was going to ask about, is there any evidence that Chancay could support more than just commercial activity? And you mentioned the fact that it being a deep water port, it opens the door for PLA Navy vessels, which, I mean, that's given the global context of where we're at right now, as we're approaching the middle of 2025, that should be a terrifying thought. I mean, if you're the U.S. or if you're an allied nation, that's not something that you ever would want.
Yeah. And to add a little bit, just, to the next question could be, could there be more? Of course, right? The contractual terms under which COSCO was granted enables them to have exclusive operational rights to the Chancay itself. In February 2021, Peruvian National Port Authority ordered COSCO exclusivity for the port's operation. In 2024, of course, the Peruvian government questions the legality of the decision, arguing that the Peruvian National Port Authority did not have the authority to grant exclusivity, yet the amendment has occurred. But for a time, they did have exclusive operational rights. And there was, of course, concerns of malpractice regarding the deal in the case of corruption, that being through lack of due diligence and also potential personal benefits for the officials approving the contract. But of course, this has, as you said, widespread geopolitical implications in the region, as this not only strengthens Chinese and Peruvian relations, but also can be a growing power projection play by the Chinese in the region, especially during a wartime scenario, like you said, with tension rising.
Right. So also, going back to something you said earlier, there's been some controversy surrounding this project from the start. Is it going to displace fishermen? Yeah, it's likely going to displace fishermen. Is it going to disrupt local housing, especially older homes, places that have been around for a long time that structurally may not be able to withstand some of the construction, just impacts, blasts, things of that nature. So disrupting the local ecosystem in a way. How's the port project being received right now, not only within Peru, but also what do regional countries think? Bolivia, places like that. I mean, Peru has neighbors.
Yeah.
What do the neighbors think?
Well, let's start with Chile, right? Chile,
sure.
With the start of Chancay, Chile has had a growing alarm with the actual port operations, as the launch of Chancay has created a bi-weekly shipping line connecting both Chancay with Chile's Litriquén and San Antonio ports. So Chancay's ability to handle ultra-large container vessels is unmatched by Chilean ports and threatens to redirect a significant volume of maritime traffic away from traditional Chilean trade hubs like in San Antonio or Valparaiso. And also, the Federation of Fruit Producers of Chile has expressed concerns that logistic delays and lack of modernization in Chilean ports will erode competitiveness in exports, particularly for fruit and perishable goods, which Chile has a large export in. And of course, as Chancay grows in stature, Chile faces pressure to rapidly upgrade its infrastructure or be at risk to have to relocate to Chancay to move their goods. But of course, when you look at Ecuador, it's kind of different for Ecuador, as they have more of a pull to ship out of Chancay versus Chile, where they're looking for modernization. But recently, actually the other day, China recently sent a delegation to Brazil to discuss further discuss a railway linking Peru to Brazil called the Brazil-Peru Transcontinental Railway. The main contractors being China Railway Erdogan Engineering Group, a subsidiary of the China Railway Engineering Corporation, which basically saw the feasibility study of the project. But this is still in the planning phases at a cost of $72 billion estimated value cost. And for Brazil, the primary purpose is to create a more cost-effective option for transporting from the interior of their country to Asian markets, particularly in their agriculture and mining commodities. So this railway would go from Mato Grosso to Chancay, then to China, basically, and run throughout all of Brazil.
So the end goal really for China is creating a logistical network on the continent that is linking different areas of interest where obviously they're probably trying to get raw materials, get it shipped cheaply over to China so that they can process those into refined goods. I mean, I think of the copper, for example, like kind of switching gears to the copper. You mentioned Peru produces an absurd amount of the global supply of copper. I think in Las Bambas alone, it's 2% of the global copper supply, which is just astronomically high for a single mine. So that... Is that part of the play there for China? Like they're trying to get some... do you view this as a resource play? Do you view it as something else?
No, this is definitely a resource play, as you were saying. In 2022, China accounted for 58% of the world's imports on copper. 2023, Peru exports to China was worth $22.5 billion, with $15.5 billion being in just copper ore. While Chinese exports for Peru that same year was only $13.8 billion, so it didn't even match the amount of copper being sent to China. And as of 2024, 70% of Peru's copper imports is to China, or copper exports are to China.
Wow. Okay.
Let me speak.
No,
so Peru has little leverage over its own resources, and in theory, Peru retains legal sovereignty over its natural resources, yet in practice, Chinese ownership has reduced states' practical control of how these resources are extracted, governed, and shared. Peru owns 5 mines, or PRC owns 5 mines in Peru, which have an estimated output capacity of more than 800,000 tons of copper a year. So China is a top destination for Peruvian mineral exports and one of the largest foreign investors in its mining industry, making this vertical integration process in economies, forcing the Peruvians to prioritize macroeconomic stability and investor confidence rather than assertive environmental or social regulations.
Okay, so with the Las Bambas mine being a critical part of this copper production, you mentioned how Chinese companies were essentially able to gain a high level of control over a lot of these natural resources, despite technically those being still under Peruvian sovereignty. How did this happen?
Like the Las Bambas, how did that mainly...
How did Chinese firms get control of that mine?
Honestly, for La Bamba specifically, it was a kind of a strategic acquisition. In April 2014, a Chinese consortium led by MMG Limited, along with Guoxin International Investment Corporation and CITIC Metal, acquired Las Bambas from Glencore for $6 billion. MMG Limited was given the largest share with 62.5% ownership. Guoxin International 22.5%, and CITIC was given 15%. The consortium paid $5.85 billion in cash, plus covered all the capital expenditures and development costs, which is around $400 million as of March 2014. And of course, the funding was backed by major Chinese state-owned banks, including the ICBC, Bank of China, and the Export-Import Bank of China, with nearly $7 billion in loans. But of course, this acquisition was part of MMG's global expansion strategy to become a top diversified mining company, as MMG is a Hong Kong-listed offshore arm of China's Minmetal Corporation, which MMG finally gained operational control of the mine once it started production in 2015.
Wow. Okay. That makes sense. So really strategic acquisition, made a good deal, backed by Chinese banks. That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Kind of beyond that, going back to the environmental social tensions with the port, did similar things happen with the mine? What kinds of controversy has surrounded that?
It's a lot at the mine, I'll tell you what. So let's start with the dust pollution and, transportation impacts. So a major source of conflict is the shift from a planned mineral pipeline to road transportation, which was approved in 2014 without sufficient consultation, which affected communities nearby. This change significantly increased dust, noise, and vibration along the unpaved and ultimately unprepared roads to haul the ore through rural villages across Apurímac and Cusco. Residents of communities reported that the dust contaminated crops, harmed livestock, and even damaged their homes, affecting both the health and livelihoods of, their population. But environmental degradation is also compounded by poorly maintained infrastructure, as communities weren't originally designed to support heavy mining traffic throughout their homes. And of course, failure to conduct meaningful environmental consultation was a large aspect in this, as Peruvian law requires citizen participation during environmental impact assessment modifications. MMG relied on the formal approval of its EIA, the Environmental Impact Assessment, yet changed by the Ministry of Energy and Mines excluded many newly affected communities. So they were able to have these approvals without the affected communities having a say in the matter. So this procedural shortcut eroded trust and denied communities the chance to propose, of course, what they would want: mitigation measures or definitions for fair compensation, which then forced them to have local populations protest and argue their rights to environmental self-determination. But of course, it ultimately changed the area and influence that MMG had on the region. This exclusion led to intensified anger, especially in areas that are now functionally impacted by not formally recognized in the project's official scope. By narrowing down the project's scope to the trucking route, MMG in Peru, authorities excluded a significant number of communities for formal recognition, which caused for daily disruptions and even more risk to their homes. So,
interesting. I'd be curious to know, and I don't know if you have this answer prepared. It's okay if not. I just am wondering, was the decision to exclude certain communities from this participation in an environmental feasibility study or similar model, has that been a pattern with other infrastructure projects in Chinese infrastructure projects, or is that an isolated incident in this particular case?
I don't have that exact question prepared, as you said, but honestly, I do not think this is a pattern, as we've seen corruption cases occur in the past, especially you can look in last episode about Ecuador, or the episode before that about Ecuador, but the Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam, right? Ecuador's largest hydroelectric dam, had significant corruption cases behind it, bribing officials for the rights of the facility, which ultimately led to environmental degradation and erosion of the nearby area.
Wow. Okay, so they're probably cutting some corners in more spots than just one. So this is probably not isolated, but I'll have to look more into that. But no, I appreciate your willingness to answer that. I know that wasn't part of the plan. But moving on, when we're talking about just general stepping back from these two examples, right? What patterns are emerging when we look at Chancay and Las Bambas side by side?
Well, what's really emerging from Las Bambas and Chancay is it represents two ends of the same supply chain. Chinese firms control both the extraction and the export infrastructure behind this, this chain of supply, allowing for less state autonomy, whether that be Peru, Brazil, Ecuador, Chile, over logistics, pricing, and security of the supply. It's a vertical integration structure that reduces Peru's role to territorial hosts with limited influence over how value is captured or redistributed. And, we haven't, this is not just only Peru issue, as I've mentioned. In Chile, Chile exports 70% of all its copper to China, all 72% of all of its lithium to China. And China Harbor Engineering Company, also known as CHEC, has designed and constructed the San Antonio terminal in Chile for $44 million, which includes transportation infrastructure and dredging and heavy machinery equipment. And of course, we've seen this also in Ecuador, where critical minerals is another key factor within Ecuador's economy, as Ecuador is looking to grow its own copper industry. And a lot of PRC state-owned enterprises are already operating two copper mines in Ecuador, including the Mirador copper gold mine, which is owned by Ecocorriente, which is a Chinese consortium. This mine is set to produce 85,000 tons of copper a year, with a total copper exports to China reaching 290,000 tons per year.
Wow. So you mentioned the San Antonio terminal in Chile, and earlier in the podcast you had mentioned, hey, there's a general concern in Chile right now because of the size, the scale of the Port of Chancay, and how they were worried, government officials there are worried that it would take significant amounts of commercial traffic away from Chile and towards Peru. So what did they do? It sounds like they just turned around to China and were like, hey, could you make us a port upgrade too? And so it just feeds into this cyclical model of, hey, we need to play catch up now. Who do we call? Well, China's giving a great deal on port building or port modernization. So of course we're going to go with them. And to your point also about vertical integration, right? For many years, there's been, a certain level of exploitation that goes on when we're talking about raw materials. You have countries that are going into other places with obvious agendas of trying to acquire these rare earth minerals, or could be other things like copper, which is a fairly common element, but it's very valuable in technology production. This has gone on for a long time, but I think what's unique about China's process is that they're one of the first places, I guess, in the quote-unquote modern era that's actually trying to fully integrate their supply chain from extraction of the resource all the way to transit of the resource and owning the final product. Is that right?
Yeah, no, spot on. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, no, I was thinking about that and thinking how, if you're controlling the entire supply chain from end to end, you have a significant advantage in cost savings and also your ability to wield your power manipulatively, essentially, by limiting or cutting off others from access to that supply chain if you own the supply chain end to end, which I think is kind of, again, a scary thought. So moving forward there, appreciate your answer on that, Martin. When we're talking infrastructure, when we're talking extractives, things like mining, things like shipping, there's an obvious marriage between the two. How do we see, and I know we just kind of touched on that, but strategically, is this, again, something that we have seen evidence of China doing in other areas, or is Peru the test case for this full ownership of the supply chain?
I wouldn't say that Peru is in any way a test case, but a continuation of what's already been occurring throughout Latin America and even Africa. PRC own substantial mining operations, especially in places like the Congo, whether that be lithium, but also, as I mentioned earlier, of course, Ecuador has large copper mines that are owned and operated by the PRC that give hundreds of thousands of tons of copper a year directly to China, and of course as well in Chile and Brazil. It has had a growing mining operation Currently in Brazil, BYD, the electric car company, Chinese owned, has bought or been approved to buy 2 plots of land in Minas Gerais, which has expanded the lithium operations that China has in the region, especially because Brazil has had a opening or widening lithium valley within their own sector of, the lithium world of Latin America.
Gotcha. No, thanks. So, looking forward to the future, what should security professionals and regional analysts be monitoring next, moving forward?
Well, they should be closely monitoring a new generation of influence operations and convergence across multiple domains, whether that be infrastructure, information, but especially political access. We know that PRC is down pat for resource extraction, transportation, and infrastructure. And although we must look at that PRC influence, we have to also look at different soft power alternatives and influences, which may also add on to how these investments or these geopolitical engagements have been so successful. And that could also be looking at the expansion of Chinese state media operations in Latin America. So analysts should maybe track how Xinhua, CGTN, and People's Daily expand their footprint in Latin America, especially Peru, Brazil, and Argentina, where Chinese investments are high. But also pay attention to local media coverage of Chinese-backed projects, right? Who's funding it, what narratives are being amplified, and whether that content has been aligning to Beijing's strategic communication goals. We saw this occur a few years ago in Australia, as in Australia for a time, China itself, mainland PRC, owned much of the local Asian-backed media coverage, and were pumping their own content to ward off certain elected officials or people going up to run, as they did not abide by PRC strategic goals. But also analyzing and looking to, of course, again, the growing CCP-aligned lobbying, specifically in Peru, monitoring whether China's United Front Work Department or affiliated organizations are developing deeper relations with Peruvian political parties, union leaders, or local mayors near key investments, to see how those diplomatic engagements can really affect the success or the hidden aspects of projects, whether that be a malpractice that occurs in the region.
Right. That's an angle to consider. I had read an article about how soft essentially Peruvian media had been on some of the controversies surrounding both Las Bambas and the Port of Chancay, and how despite Peru having a fairly robust journalism sector and freedom of media has been traditionally not, it's been decent there in the past, but the remark of the article that I had read was to the effect that any criticism of those projects has been kept very, very shallow and focused more on surface level concerns. And very, very little has been said regarding some of the deeper, maybe potentially more sinister implications of what these projects mean, and how, hey, maybe China essentially sponsored a trip for Peruvian journalists to go and train in China for a time before being sent back, and how that may have had something to do with it. Obviously, someone could put two and two together and see that, there's some evidence there that some narratives are being amplified and other narratives being crushed. So I think that's important to consider, and I think that your point to analysts, hey, keep your eyes out. So that makes sense. Finally, what signals from open sources have been most revealing in your research? You've obviously gone deep on this topic. What have been some of the things that you've looked at most, or where has been most valuable?
Well, countries with high mineral prospects is always a region of high key interest for the PRC. Green energy transition is a priority by the PRC, as you can tell, with whether that be electric vehicles or clean energy, but that's usually used as soft power investment strategies to have more of their hard power within critical transportation claims like the Port of Chancay or a transcontinental railway between Brazil and Peru. But definitely the green energy transition has been most revealing in my research. The PRC have invested in many renewable different sources throughout the region. Brazil will always be one of the biggest partners with the PRC because, of course, BRICS and how much commercial investment the PRC have in Brazil as a whole. We have a lot of American companies who had to sell their assets in Brazil, specifically like Duke Energy for $1.2 billion in 2016, because it became a financial pit for that American company to be able to hold their assets in Brazil. So they need to sell it to the quickest and most effective buyer, which was the Chinese.
Right.
Also, from my research, I found that the pattern is similar to how they operate in Africa, where they're not afraid to come in and build the infrastructure bottom up, whether that be with electric vehicles or any other form of investment. Latin America can be seen as a place not ready for electric vehicles, but they have a significant market already in the electric vehicle space because the PRC are coming in and helping to build that infrastructure for those cities to be able to operate many different electric vehicles, especially because a lot of them are plug-in hybrids where they have the internal combustion, but also the green energy electric background. And finally, in my research, what I found is, as someone who works at the Security Research Hub, a dashboard that we look at within our Chinese Activities Hub is a just problematic projects. And what we've found so far are 74 different sites with detrimental damages, whether that be to indigenous communities or environmental degradation or corruption. And I've seen consistently throughout the region that, although green energy transition is a priority for the PRC, they also have many different projects that have consistent and multiple malpractices behind them, such as with the China Communications Company and China Harbor Engineering Corporation. They have significant and consistent malpractices throughout any Latin American country, whether that be, Panama or Jamaica. But yeah, overall success in investing.
Thank you. Yeah, having seen some of the Security Research Hub's dashboards myself, I think it was pretty illuminating just to be able to not only visualize a lot of what's going on in the region in terms of issues, public perception of different infrastructure projects that China has down there, but also be able to really dig deep into the financials of who these companies are, where they're putting their money, what are the different types of projects China's invested in. So I think it's great work that's being done, and I appreciate you for your time today. And to close, ports and mines, they might look like economics, simple business moves on the surface. You might say to yourself, every country has strategic interests, and that is true. But I think below all of that, there's a deeper contest going on between sovereignty, strategy in business and in the social sphere, and control. And I think China has made a play here in Peru to get its hand into all three. So I think I just want to thank you one more time, Martin. Thanks for helping us kind of decode this situation. It helps a lot. And for listeners in national security, geopolitics, regional planning, or industry, I think this episode hopefully provides some insight into some of what's going on just in our backyard here in the U.S., but also just in the North and South America, Central America, the Caribbean as a whole. We got to watch out. We got to stay vigilant because China's out there. They're making a play, and it's something to consider moving forward when we're talking geopolitical strategy and foreign policy. So without further ado, hey, this has been a great episode and conversation of Navigating in Balance, podcast by Three Gimbals, Martin Brown from FIU. Thank you very much. And until next time, everybody, stay aware, keep navigating in balance. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben.